Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
Except you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did, yeah.
It took a while.
Jordan Peterson is in the heat for destroying the wokeness, so let's jump right into his most savage takes.
Men and women are basically alike in terms of personality, in terms of cognitive ability, in terms of leadership, but what it did find was that media depictions of men and women as fundamentally different perpetuate misconceptions, as does workplace bias.
Oh God, so it's my fault.
So
men and women actually are more the same than they are different. But the issue is that small differences at the population level can turn into very large differences at the extreme. So, for example, men and women are broadly similar with regards to aggression, although men tilt a little bit more towards aggression. So that if you picked a random person out of the population, male and female, and you guessed that the male was more aggressive, you'd be right 60% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, they're all male. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that? Just out of curiosity. What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? And men work longer hours. They work more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to move. They're more likely to work outside. They're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable. They make more money for those reasons. And that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. It's a very simplistic analysis, and trying to address
I was just going to say, Sophie, can you come back on that?
What I'm trying to equalise is opportunity and choice.
Fine, let's equalise choice.
You agree on that.
But we won't get equal outcome that way.
And I think that what happens then, nobody knows, because we've never done it.
Stop the cap.
We do know. We know what's happened in Scandinavia.
But it's not fully got there yet.
No, but it's going in the opposite direction that everyone predicted, and strongly.
So Jordan Peterson puts the reality of gender differences up for debate, but the interviewers didn't factor in that men oftentimes work worse jobs. But it isn't the only time Peterson had his say on the gender discussion.
Well, in Iceland, an energy company was about to go bankrupt. A new manager came in and said, okay, we've got to throw everything out and start again, and made a conscious decision based on his belief that it's a human right that men and women are paid equally. And so went out of his way to make the workforce within that company 50-50 as much as he could in terms of men and women being represented. So we're talking about engineers, we're talking about tradespeople, we're talking about in workshops, we're talking at the managerial level.
If you hire 50% women engineers and 50% male engineers, then the women engineers are less qualified because the pool of engineers is lower among women. So you can't hire 50% women engineers without producing a decrement in the quality of the engineers. Bruh. Because the selection pool is too small. You can't do that on a large scale. You might be able to do that in one company.
Yeah, and they certainly argue that it's not tokenism and they're not hiring second-rate women.
They might argue that, but if you did it on a large scale, that's what would happen. Because look, you think about it mathematically. If there's 10 times as many male engineers as there are female engineers, and you insist upon hiring 50-50, then obviously the degree to which the female engineers are proficient cannot be the same as the degree to which the male engineers are proficient. It's mathematically impossible.
So you're saying don't even try?
No, I'm saying something much more specific than that. Now, one company might be able to do that for a short period of time in one isolated location. But there, of course, if you have a new manager come in and he's doing all sorts of new things, there's 50 reasons why the company is going to fail or succeed. And you can say, well, it was because of the gender equity policies. It's like, yeah, well, it's a multivariate problem.
But they do point to the diversity now of the workforce, to improved morale, to improved strategies on how to come up with solutions to their increased profitability.
None of that research is credible. There's no evidence whatsoever that diversity as measured by racial or gender representation has any bearing whatsoever on creativity, productivity, outcome, any of the things you're measuring. None of that research is credible in the least. It's not at all. Men and women make different amounts of money. Well, sorry.
Got 'em.
That's not a fine-grained enough analysis. More agreeable people get paid less.
Jordan Peterson completely denies the ideas that the woke interviewer wanted to debate.
Are you against the use of alternate pronouns?
I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to?
I think I've made my position on that clear already.
Well, perhaps not to our audience at home who are just being introduced to this. Would you use alternate pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
Well, we have a graphic to show our audience at home, just some of the pronouns being used or asked to be used as alternates. Among them you see here Z or Zim, Z or here, Z or Zir, also hey, or a rather, and per. So just some of the alternate pronouns there. Professor Pete, when you hear Professor Peterson saying that this is oppressive, how do you respond to that?
The Peterson drama has done real harm to real people on campus. He's made it harder to be transgender or non-binary. I know this from personal experience. I'm non-binary and transgender, and I know how it's felt to be on the U of T campus for the last month. And I also know from private communications with other affected people. You know, in New Zealand where I grew up, academics have a statutory role enshrined in the Education Act to be a critic and conscience of society. So I think that's an idea worth exporting to Canada. So I'd like to give Peterson about a B+ for his critic role recently, and an F for the conscience part. A student once said to me when I finally obtained tenure, "Now, Professor, now that you have obtained superpowers, you must agree to use them for good, for peace and justice." So I invite Peterson to start doing more of that.
Well, Professor Peterson, those who are asking for this alternate use of alternate pronouns, they are saying it boils down to respecting their human rights. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it boils down to respecting their human rights. I think that it's an imposition on freedom of speech that's being implemented at a legislative level. I also think that if there was a naturally evolving solution to the linguistic problem that's being posed by a small fraction of the transgender community, that people would have already adopted it. We've never had a situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke.
Gotcha.
Has a very dangerous precedent. So it's one thing to tell people what they can't say. So for example, we have legislation making it illegal to do such things as deny the Holocaust. It's a completely different thing to demand that people use certain words when they're formulating their own ideas. And I mean, it's also absurd. I mean, here's one thing that's happened that I don't believe the formulators of this legislation ever foresaw. So in New York City, for example, there are now 31 protected gender identities. And I see no reason whatsoever why each of those gender identities can't demand the use of their own pronoun. And that absurd things like that have been happening on the University of Michigan campus, for example, where students have been given permission to tell faculty members and others what pronouns they're to be addressed by, and they're multiplying rapidly out of control. So the law is bad from an ethical perspective. It's sloppily written, and besides that, the solution that it imposes is practically untenable.
Well, sorry, excuse me for jumping in, but I want to bring in Professor Pete here because we did show those words to our audience at home, and perhaps the control room can show it to our audience once again. When you look at those alternate pronouns, I think it's fair to say that some people will see that at home and see that as very unwieldy, if you will. What do you say to those types of criticisms, including the one that you just heard from Professor Peterson?
Well, I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse. What the? you know, we call somebody what they want to be called in our society. For instance, I don't call somebody Julie if they prefer to be called Jordan. That's just basic human courtesy. Here's a great little tip for people who are despairing at the possibility of remembering all those pronouns. What I do is just program in the pronoun next to the person's name in my smartphone. So whenever I'm out and about and I've forgotten whether one of my trans friends uses ze or zer or they or them or something else, I just look it up and it's really super easy. One thing I'd like you to really look at in regard to this controversy is to watch out for who's getting centered in a discussion. Political correctness is code that powerful people use when they're annoyed that they're actually not the center of attention in any given discussion. And Bill C-16 is actually not about cisgender people, it's about protections for transgender people. And that's not, you know, it's not about Jordan Peterson. So, you know, we should have people learning to listen more. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a very good reason. When things get political, I like to ask who benefits and who gets to decide the rules of the game. So, you know, mostly with this Peterson controversy, which is really just a small drama, a tempest in a teapot, you know, he could just get over learning to program a few pronouns into his phone. By the way, I only have half a dozen or so that I actually use on an everyday basis, so it's not all that difficult.
Professor Peterson, sorry, Professor Peterson, you can jump in because I think Professor Peterson wants to get in on that.
Yeah, well, kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say. So, you know, if we're bandying back and forth our differences in values, you know, I would say that the highest possible value is truth, and that one of the concomitants is that we need stringent protection for freedom of speech so that we can utter the truths that we see fit. And I think that that's a value that's much higher than kindness, for example. I mean, there's lots of situations in life where kindness in the immediate present is not the appropriate way to react at all.
But
so, for example, when you discipline children, you often hurt their feelings in the short term so that they can learn to behave properly in the medium to long term so that their lives go well. And so this automatic assumption that the people on the social justice warrior side of the equation are motivated only by kindness when they're also clearly motivated by power is something I find completely untenable. And I don't think that Pete's solution to program my cell phone so that I can remember what names people need to be called is a reasonable solution at all. We're actually supposed to now use electronic devices to bolster our ability to speak freely in case we offend someone.
Is it so difficult to remember a pronoun? You remember somebody's first name, you remember their telephone number.
Stop it.
I mean, I think that it's
I don't
very,
remember
very
people's
true
first names
that
very easily, and I don't remember their telephone numbers very easily. And when I see a stranger, I call them by the pronoun that seems to be in accordance with their presented appearance. And
that's you
they
being
appear
lazy,
that way.
Jordan. That's you being lazy. I think there's a very high value that we should also be aiming for in addition to truth. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, I have told the truth at every turn. So, you know, trying to imply that that's not what's happening on people on the social justice, am I a social justice warrior? I don't know. But I think that we should be aiming for pluralism. This means recognizing more than one set of fundamental principles, fostering independent cultural traditions of minorities, and being willing to share power with people who are different than you. I think if you just stop centering this whole controversy on yourself and how hard it is for you to accommodate genderqueer people, well, have a little bit of sympathy. I mean, those of us who are trans encounter much more greater indignities every day and every week of the month. For example, have you recently had a bank employee accuse you of trying to masquerade as yourself at a bank and then locking down your ATM card and credit card so that you can't use any money? Those are the sorts of problems that trans people face every day, being out of housing, being considered, you know, considering suicide.
You're a victim.
These are really big problems.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Problem, isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people
Jordan,
actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They
just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked to a few trans people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like to be trans.
Professor Pete, Professor Peterson, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right. So the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected you either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself, and on behalf of other people, perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself.
Jordan Peterson is not easy to win a debate against. Both his knowledge in this area and the way he carefully puts his sentences together makes him tough to argue against. Anyways, if you enjoyed, then like and subscribe and see you next time.